What's up, everyone? Welcome to Sir Hunt's Reviews. My name's Mark, and in this video, we're going to be discussing dragons. Why not? Because the show is called House of the Dragon. It's in the title. And also, this video was requested by one of my Patreon members over on patreon.com/SirHuntsReviews. In this video, I'm going to discuss how the Valyrians made dragons, and I'll discuss a little bit about Vhagar and Caraxes. This video isn't going to be very long, so please slap a like on it. The like goal is going to be 420. My name's Mark, and thank you for watching. Patreon, I forgot to mention, is basically just a way for me to combat YouTube's ranking system. They delist my videos, meaning for a few hours, they show up in the ranking systems if you type in House of the Dragon or The Winds of Winter or Sir Hunts, but then after that, they virtually disappear. And for a video to do well in YouTube's system, it has to be ranked and listed for at least 24 hours. So to combat that, instead of, not making videos, I just decided to push my Patreon in every video. So thanks again to these individuals right here, and thank you for watching. If you can't contribute, the best thing you can do for YouTube creators here on YouTube that you like is to just watch the videos. Now, for those who are unaware, Valyrians of old were originally shepherds. They discovered dragons in what's believed to be the 14 Flames, right? A bunch of volcanic islands over in Essos that, in my opinion, is the source of fire magic in the World of Ice and Fire. Not the book, but it actually, several characters call it Earth, so we'll say it's Earth, right? Even though George specifically has said that it's not Earth. But on Earth, the Valyrians, when they were shepherds, they discovered the 14 Flames, right? That's what the World of Ice and Fire tells us. They used the dragons to eventually make the Valyrian freehold, and they enslaved and conquered all of the surrounding lands, and they had massive amounts of dragons and dragon lords. And eventually, the fire magic associated with that area blew it the fuck up, and the Targaryens left about 12 years before then because Daenerys the Dreamer warned her father. They went to one of the furthest Valyrian outposts, really close to Westeros. It was known as Dragonstone. All of the dragons that they brought with them are the ones that are going to be taking place in House of the Dragon, for the most part. Descendants of those dragons, anyway. Now, one thing that is interesting is that potentially dragons have been around for way longer than the 300 years that it's been since the Doom of Valyria, somewhat, right? Dragons have to have been around because there are way too many things. For instance, there's these forts, right, that are along, very similar to the wall in Westeros. You know how you have the Night Fort, Castle Black, right? There's the 5 forts of ET over in Essos, and dragons were used in the forging of those. And then also in Westeros, you have Old Town, which is literally the oldest town in Westeros. That's why it's called Old Town. But there's this place called Battle Isle, and no one knows how Battle Isle got its name, but if you look at the foundations of the High Tower itself, it had to be using Valyrian magic and just the fusing of the stones, right? So Valyrian stonemasons didn't have to use hammer and chisel and brick and mortar to fuse shit. They did it seamlessly, and they used dragon fire somehow to do so. They probably had a device that could harness the power of wildfire, and that is said to be very similar to dragon fire. And this is how they fused seamless stone towers like the one in Old Town, the High Tower, right? So if you follow those theories, dragons have been around way before the Valyrians discovered them in the Valyrian freehold, or the 14 Flames, rather. In my opinion, they were around during the founding of Asshai, most likely, because those 5 forts of ET have been around for way longer than the wall in Westeros, and it just makes sense that dragons came from this area, so of course they would have been around longer. It seems like the world, Planetos, Earth, right? It seems like that world is very cyclical, and everything happens in cycles, and we just get different interpretations that are fucked up because of the passage of time, but it's basically the same thing happening over and over again. You have a fire god fighting with an ice god, then you have a water god or a storm god fighting with a land and earth god, right? And they basically destroy the planet, and man's memory gets wiped out, and then the same thing keeps happening over and over again, just at different locations, right? So getting way back on track here, the Valyrians were taught, in my opinion, by the first Dragon Lords how to control and tame their dragons. And they mated and breeded with the Valyrians, which gave them those specific features. And since they decided to keep their blood pure, the Targaryens and the Valyrians of old passed that genetic ability to control dragons down from one to the other. Now, what's interesting is that in the books, you have different types of dragons, different colors of dragons, right? So black dragons are known to be the biggest. Red dragons are known to be the most vicious and the most badass, and they could take out black dragons, which are way bigger than them, right? You also have pink dragons with golden dragons with pink membranes, which are probably more for looks and aesthetics, and black dragons were breeded for war, and red dragons were breeded for conquest, right? Or the other way around. So red dragons were breeded for war and black dragons for conquest because they're so intimidating, and really you wouldn't even have to use it. You would just see one and be like, what the fuck is this? Oh my god, we don't want to take our stuff, Valyrians, please. But yeah, so like that's kind of a working theory that I have, really. It's not confirmed in the books. Like, we know that there's different types of dragons. There's different colors of them. They obviously serve different purposes. But my theory is that the Valyrians of old, the shepherds, would breed them very much like how we breed dogs, right? So we went from a big-ass wolfhound to a little baby chihuahua, right? And we did that by selective breeding. So Targaryens probably did this as well. It's mentioned in A World of Ice and Fire that wyverns were mated with firewyrms to create dragons, because wyverns are fireless dragons. They can fly, they're big, they look exactly like dragons, but they can't breathe fire. Firewyrms don't necessarily look like dragons, but they can burrow through rock, very much like Viserion does in the Game of Thrones books. In A Dance with Dragons, he makes his lair up in the rocks when Daenerys keeps them under the pyramid in Meereen. But it's mentioned in A World of Ice and Fire, the Valyrians of old crossbred the two of them to make dragons. Now, if dragons had been around before them, it's still possible that the Valyrians could do that, because maybe those dragons that were ancient and old were too powerful for them to control, and maybe since they weren't around during the creation process, those dragons don't respect them as much. So it's still possible that they could have crossbreeded the two of those. But it's just an interesting thing. Naturally, those two creatures could have mated. It's just, there's something about Valyrians in general. They're like people of fire magic that allows them to control the dragons. And I'm kind of like all over the place in this video, right? To touch more on the breeding practices, I think that it's also possible, and this idea was put into my head by Reflective Rambling. She's one of the members of my Patreon family over on patreon.com. But she mentioned that maybe some of the dragons were inbred, right? Because obviously there's dogs like a pug that has terrible... She didn't mention this part, but I'm just sort of expanding on that thought that she had. Pugs have breathing problems because they're inbred too much. So if you get dragons that are too inbred, you could have someone like Cannibal, who's this black dragon that, according to the small folk of Westeros, Cannibal has been around since before the Targaryens even came over and conquered Westeros. That's just probably not true, because he just would have been massive, right? But it's just interesting when you look at my dragon breeding theory as a whole, because it kind of makes sense. If you all agree with it, let me know down below in the comment section. Now, in particular for this series, we have two dragons that I'm most excited to see. Like, I want to see Sunfire the Golden, but Sunfire gets horrifically maimed, so I'm not as excited about that, right? So the two dragons that I want to see the most are Vhagar and Caraxes. Vhagar was around during the conquering of Westeros and was flown by one of Aegon's sister wives, Viscenia, right? So Rhaenys and Caraxes were killed during, I think, the second Dorne invasion. Took a bolt to the eye. Rhaenys probably survived and was tortured because Aegon is handed this letter, Aegon the Conqueror, so this is about 120, depending on where you look at in the timeline of House of the Dragon. This is about 100 years before the events of the new series, House of the Dragon. But Aegon tries to invade Dorne several times, and the second time he loses his sister wife, who was his true love, right? So Viscenia becomes his queen's guard. She basically bests all of the knights around him and tells him, hey, look, man, you need to make a fucking guard to protect your stupid ass, because we're getting poisoned left and right. We're having attempts on our lives all the time, right? And Rhaenys was very much like his love. He loved making love to her. And their son Aenys is actually said to be a bastard of some poet or whatever. Right? All of that is besides the point, right? So Vhagar was written by Viscenia and was around during that time, so Vhagar's had about 100 years to get big and strong. And the only reason why she's known as she is because she laid a clutch of eggs, right? That's the only way that you determine a dragon's sex, is if they lay a clutch of eggs or not. If they don't, well, then they're male, and if they do, well, then they're female. Septon Barth believed, if I'm not mistaken, it was Septon Barth, believed that dragons could change their sex at will, and there are actual lizards and reptiles that can do that in real life. So I'd like to believe that dragons in this series can do that as well. But Vhagar is big and terrible and mean. And what's interesting is that she's written by Laena in the beginning of the series, and Laena is married to Daemon. Daemon rides Carraxies, so Carraxies and Vhagar are very much besties at the beginning of this series. And then when Vhagar is mounted by Aemon, well, Aemon's on the green and Daemon's on the blacks. So obviously there's conflict and turmoil there. And guess what? Vhagar and Carraxies die together in the battle above the God's Eye. Carraxies, red and terrible. About half the size of Vhagar, but way more ferocious. Like, for instance, when Carraxies takes out Vhagar, Carraxies kills Vhagar, but Carraxies is obviously mortally wounded. The dragon is so terrifying and terrible and magnificent and fucking amazing that it's actually able to pull itself ashore and then dies ashore, right? But still, Vhagar wasn't able to do that. Vhagar died and fucking went down. Carraxies survived the battle long enough to pull itself ashore, which is amazing. So I feel like this video's been long enough. I've been taking up a bunch of you guys' time recently. If you want me to go more in depth and do an further deep dive into dragons and maybe put on some more tinfoil theories for you guys, let me know down below in the comment section. Special thank you to these individuals and special thank you to you for watching. My name's Mark and this has been Sir Hunt's Zaldrizas Postari Hixos. Edit champ, edit king. Dao.